The city was alive with movement. Bright lights flickered from towering buildings, the streets filled with people rushing home after a long day. Car horns echoed through the air, blending with the distant sound of sirens. It was just another ordinary evening in New York. Naomi Carter stepped out of a small cafe, a warm cup of coffee in her hand. She inhaled deeply, letting the rich aroma calm her nerves. It had been a tiring day, full of meetings and reports, and she was finally heading home. Dressed casually in jeans, a black leather jacket, and sneakers, she blended into the crowd. No one would guess that she was one of the highest-ranking officers in the city. As she walked toward her car, parked just across the street, she felt a strange sensation. An instinct, a feeling she had learned to trust over the years. Someone was watching her. Her eyes flickered to the side, scanning the area without turning her head too much. Two uniformed officers stood near the entrance of a convenience store, their eyes locked onto her. She noticed the way they whispered to each other, the way their hands hovered near their belts. She had seen this scene play out before, many times, but never like this. Naomi took a slow step forward, pretending not to notice them. The grip on her coffee tightened just slightly. Then it happened. "Ma'am, stop right there." A deep voice cut through the noise of the street. She turned her head, her brows knitting together. The officer who spoke, tall, broad-shouldered, with short blonde hair, was already approaching her. His partner, a younger officer with dark brown hair, followed closely behind. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked, keeping her voice calm. The blonde officer, Brian Mitchell, exchanged a look with his partner before speaking again. "Put your hands where we can see them." A flicker of disbelief passed through Naomi's eyes. She tilted her head slightly. "Excuse me." "Now, Mom." Brian's voice grew sharper. People on the sidewalk slowed their steps. A few glanced in their direction, sensing tension. Naomi's heartbeat remained steady, but something inside her sank. She had worked in law enforcement for over 20 years. She had trained officers, handled high-risk cases, and worked in some of the toughest neighborhoods. Yet here she was, being treated like a suspect without any explanation. She had a choice to make: react with anger, demand answers, or stay calm and see how far this would go. She chose the last option. Slowly, she raised her hands, still holding the coffee cup. "What's this about?" Jake Simmons, the younger officer, took a cautious step forward. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." Naomi held back a sigh. "And what description is that?" "Female, African American, mid-40s, short hair," Jake said quickly. Naomi let the words hang in the air for a second. That was it. That was all they needed to stop her on the street. "That's a pretty vague description," she said. Brian's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, we're not going to ask again. Turn around and place your hands on the car." A small crowd had started to gather now. The energy in the air shifted. People pulled out their phones, recording. Naomi could feel the weight of their stares pressing against her. This was a moment she had seen play out too many times. She could refuse. She could pull out her badge, demand respect, remind them who she was. But she already knew what that would lead to. So she took a deep breath and did as they asked. As soon as she turned, Brian grabbed her wrist and yanked it behind her back. His grip was firm, almost too tight. Jake moved quickly, pulling out handcuffs and locking them around her wrists. A sharp, cold bite of metal. The sound of the cuffs clicking into place felt heavier than it should have. "This is a mistake," Naomi said, her voice still controlled. Brian muttered something into his radio. "Suspect in custody. Bringing her in now." Naomi's jaw clenched. She could feel her patience slipping, but she forced herself to stay still. "You're making a mistake," she repeated, this time looking straight at Jake. He hesitated for half a second, just enough for Naomi to notice. There was uncertainty in his eyes, doubt. But Brian was already moving, guiding her toward the squad car. The crowd murmured. Someone shouted. She didn't do anything. Another voice. Do you even know who she is? The officers ignored them. Naomi exhaled slowly. She knew this moment wouldn't just disappear. It would spread. The videos, the questions, the consequences. This would not be forgotten. And neither would she. The police car moved through the streets, its sirens off, but the tension inside was louder than any noise outside. Naomi sat in the back seat, her hands still cuffed, the cold metal pressing against her skin. The city lights flashed through the window, casting long shadows across her face. She didn't speak. She didn't fight. She only watched. Brian Mitchell was driving, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His jaw was clenched, his expression stiff, as if he was trying to convince himself that what they had done was right. His partner, Jake Simmons, sat in the front passenger seat, stealing nervous glances at the mirror. He looked uneasy now, shifting in his seat every few seconds. Naomi could feel the hesitation. She had seen it before. The moment when an officer started questioning their own actions but was too afraid to admit it. The car stopped at a red light. Naomi took a slow breath. How long have you both been on the job? Jake glanced at Brian before answering. 3 years. Naomi nodded slightly. And in those 3 years, how many times have you arrested someone just because they matched a description? Silence filled the car. Brian kept his eyes on the road, refusing to engage. Jake swallowed hard, but didn't answer. Naomi leaned back against the seat. You know, I could have resisted. I could have asked you to check my ID. But I didn't. Brian's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. You were a suspect. We followed protocol. Naomi let out a small, humorless laugh. Protocol. She shook her head. Tell me something, Officer Mitchell. If I were a white woman, same clothes, same place, would you have arrested me so quickly? Brian's grip on the wheel tightened, but he didn't respond. Jake turned slightly in his seat, his voice quieter now. We were just doing our job. Naomi's eyes locked onto his in the mirror. Then maybe you should ask yourself why your job led you to arrest the wrong person tonight. The light turned green, and the car started moving again. The station was only a few minutes away. Naomi already knew what was going to happen when they arrived. The second they walked through those doors, everything would change. And Brian and Jake had no idea. The car pulled into the precinct parking lot. Brian parked and took a deep breath before stepping out. Jake followed, opening the back door. Step out, Jake said. His voice wasn't as firm now. Naomi moved slowly, stepping out of the car with controlled movements. Even now, she didn't want to give them any excuse to say she was resisting. The moment she stepped inside the station, heads turned. Officers who had been talking and laughing just moments ago suddenly went quiet. Some of them froze, their eyes widening. Others looked at Brian and Jake with pure disbelief. A young officer near the front desk dropped the pen he was holding. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Brian felt the shift in energy, but he didn't understand why. Naomi stood tall, her face calm, her eyes steady. That's when a voice rang through the station. A deep, commanding voice that made the air feel heavier. What the hell is going on here? Chief Ryan Anderson stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Naomi. He was an older man, his graying hair combed back, his expression always serious. But now, his face looked pale. Brian turned quickly. Sir, we. Uncuff her. Right now, Anderson snapped. Brian and Jake hesitated, looking at each other in confusion. Anderson's voice boomed again. Now. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hand shaking as he unlocked the cuffs. Naomi rubbed her wrists, feeling the soreness left behind by the metal. Brian finally found his voice. Sir, she matched the description off. Anderson's gaze cut through him like a knife. Do you two have any idea who she is? Jake's throat went dry. He felt the weight of dozens of eyes on them now. His hands clenched at his sides. We. Anderson took a step closer. She's Captain Naomi Carter, head of Internal Affairs. The words hit like a thunderclap. Brian felt his stomach drop. His breathing slowed, the pieces clicking together in his head. Captain, Internal Affairs. They had just arrested one of the most powerful officers in the department. Jake took a step back, as if trying to physically distance himself from the mistake. We didn't know," he stammered. Anderson's expression darkened. "You didn't check her ID. You didn't confirm before putting cuffs on her." Naomi's voice was steady. "No, they didn't." A cold silence filled the room. Brian swallowed hard. He had been so sure, so confident in his actions. But now, standing here, with dozens of officers staring at him like he was the biggest fool in the department, he felt something creeping in. Regret. Naomi turned to face them fully. "Tell me something," she said softly. "If I hadn't been Captain Carter, if I had been an ordinary person, what would have happened next?" Brian didn't answer. Neither did Jake. Because deep down, they both knew the truth. They had seen it before. Cases where someone was arrested without proof, held for hours, sometimes even charged for a crime they didn't commit, just because the officers refused to admit they were wrong. And tonight, they had almost done the same thing. Anderson exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "My office. Now." Brian and Jake nodded stiffly and followed him, their feet feeling heavier with every step. Naomi watched them go. She had been in this system long enough to know that this was not just about two officers making a mistake. This was bigger than them. This was about how the system worked, and how much it needed to change. The station was quiet, but tension filled the air like a storm about to break. Officers whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the closed office door where Chief Anderson had taken Brian and Jake. No one knew exactly what was being said inside, but they could all guess. The weight of their mistake had settled heavily over the room. Naomi Carter stood near the front desk, her hands resting on the wooden surface. Her wrists still ached from the cuffs, but she barely noticed the pain. Her mind was elsewhere. She had spent years building her career, fighting for justice, making sure the system worked the way it was supposed to. And yet tonight, she had become just another person wrongly arrested. She had seen this happen too many times, and she was tired of it. A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Captain Carter." She turned to see Officer Rachel Bennett, one of the few officers in the department she trusted. Rachel was younger, in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and a strong presence. She had always been one of the good ones, one of the few who truly wanted change. "Rachel," Naomi said, her voice steady. Rachel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Are you okay?" Naomi gave a small nod. "I'm fine." Rachel frowned. "No, you're not." For the first time that night, Naomi let herself exhale, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. "It's not just about me, Rachel. It's about how easily this happened. How many times have we seen this play out before?" Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. Naomi looked around the station, at the officers pretending to work but secretly listening. Some of them looked guilty. Others looked ashamed. And then there were those who looked indifferent, as if this was just another night. That was the problem. This wasn't just another night, and she wouldn't let it be. The door to Chief Anderson's office swung open, and Brian and Jake stepped out. Their faces were pale, their movements stiff. It was clear that whatever had happened in that office had shaken them. Anderson followed closely behind, his expression unreadable. He stopped in front of Naomi and spoke in a firm voice. They'd been suspended, pending investigation. A heavy silence followed. Brian didn't say a word. He didn't argue. He simply lowered his head slightly, as if accepting his fate. Jake, however, hesitated. He glanced at Naomi, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like regret. Naomi met his gaze, waiting. Jake opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. After a second, he gave a small nod, then turned and walked away. Naomi watched him go, Unsure whether to feel relief or frustration, she turned back to Anderson. And then what? Anderson studied her carefully. Then we review the case, and we make sure it doesn't happen again. Naomi let out a slow breath. You and I both know this isn't just about two officers making a bad call. It's about a system that allows it to happen in the first place. Anderson sighed, rubbing his temple. You're right. His voice was quieter now. But change doesn't happen overnight, Carter. You know that better than anyone. Naomi did know that. But tonight, she had reached her breaking point. She had spent years believing that she could change things from the inside. That if she worked hard enough, fought long enough, she could fix the system. But how do you fix something that refuses to change? She had spent her whole career following the rules. Maybe it was time to break them. Anderson must have seen something in her expression because his eyes narrowed slightly. Naomi. But she was already moving. She turned and walked out of the station, stepping back into the cold night air. The city stretched out in front of her, the lights glowing like tiny stars. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done. The city never truly slept. Even at this hour, the streets were alive, cars rushing past, neon signs flickering, voices blending into a distant hum. Naomi Carter walked with steady steps, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. The cold breeze touched her face, but she barely noticed. Her mind was a storm, thoughts crashing into each other, impossible to control. She had spent years believing in the system, thinking that if she worked hard enough, if she proved herself, she could make things better. But tonight had shown her the bitter truth. The system didn't see her as Captain Naomi Carter. It saw her as just another black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if it could happen to her, what about those who didn't have a badge? What about those who didn't have a Chief Anderson to step in? Her stomach tightened at the thought. She had fought for justice her entire life, but tonight, justice had turned its back on her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Rachel. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Naomi. Rachel's voice was careful, measured. Where are you? Just walking, Naomi replied. You should come back, Rachel said. People are talking. Officers, reporters. This is bigger than we thought. Naomi stopped walking. What do you mean? Rachel hesitated before answering. Someone leaked the footage. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. What footage? The arrest. Someone recorded the whole thing and put it online. It's everywhere now. The department is in full damage control mode. Naomi closed her eyes for a second. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to be this fast. Are they protecting Brian and Jake? She asked, already knowing the answer. Rachel sighed. They're trying to spin it, saying it was a misunderstanding, saying you weren't mistreated. They're already pushing the following protocol story. Naomi's jaw tightened. She had spent her entire career standing up for what was right. And now, the very people she worked with were trying to bury the truth. She had two choices. Let them control the story, or take control herself. She made her decision in seconds. I'm going to the press, Naomi said. Rachel inhaled sharply. Naomi, wait. No, Naomi cut in. If they want to call this a misunderstanding, let's make them explain it to the world. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, finally, Rachel spoke. I'll back you up, she said. Whatever you need. Naomi nodded to herself. Thank you, Rachel. She ended the call and turned, her steps more determined now. She wasn't just going to talk. She was going to make sure the world listened. Because the bitter truth was out, and she wasn't going to let them cover it up. The newsroom was buzzing with energy. Reporters typed furiously, phones rang nonstop, and television screens flashed breaking news updates. Naomi Carter sat in the center of it all, her face calm, her hands folded in her lap. But inside, she felt the weight of what was about to happen. She had been in the public eye before, interviews, press conferences, internal meetings. But this was different. This wasn't about her achievements or her role as captain of internal affairs. This was about exposing the system that had turned on one of its own. A young journalist, Daniel Hayes, sat across from her, a microphone clipped to his shirt. He had sharp eyes, the kind that saw through excuses. The camera crew signaled they were ready, and the red light blinked on. "We're live in 3, 2, 1. Daniel leaned forward. "Captain Carter, thank you for being here." Naomi nodded. "Thank you for having me." He didn't waste time. "The video of your arrest has gone viral. Millions have seen it. People are outraged. Can you walk us through what happened that night?" Naomi took a slow breath. "I was leaving a cafe. 2 officers approached me, said I matched the description of a suspect. Before I could even explain who I was, they had me in cuffs. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't confirm anything. They just assumed." Daniel frowned. "And when they brought you to the station?" Naomi's voice remained steady. "That's when they realized their mistake. I was released and the officers were suspended. But this isn't about me. It's about what this represents." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" Naomi met his eyes. "If I hadn't been Captain Carter, if I had been just another citizen, what would have happened? Would they have admitted their mistake? Or would they have doubled down, found a way to justify the arrest? How many people don't get the chance to prove their innocence?" Silence filled the room for a moment. Daniel nodded. "People are asking for accountability. What do you think should happen next?" Naomi didn't hesitate. "We need real change, not just apologies, not just suspensions. We need better training. We need officers to be held accountable when they abuse their power. And we need to stop pretending that these mistakes only happen to certain people by accident." The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the determination in her eyes. Daniel cleared his throat. "Some people are saying this is being blown out of proportion, that the officers were just doing their job." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Their job is to protect and serve, not to assume guilt based on appearance. If they had taken 2 extra seconds to verify who I was, none of this would have happened. That's the problem." Daniel leaned back, considering her words. "Captain Carter, do you think this will lead to real change?" Naomi's lips pressed into a firm line. "It has to." The red light on the camera blinked off. The interview was over, but Naomi knew this was just the beginning. The city felt different now. The streets were the same, the lights still flickered, and the voices of people blended into a familiar hum. But something had shifted. It wasn't just the news reports, the debates on television, or the endless discussions on social media. It was the way people looked at her when she walked past. Some with admiration, some with curiosity, and some with hesitation. Naomi Carter knew why. Her interview had shaken the system. The department had been forced to respond, and the officers involved were no longer just names in an internal report. Their actions had consequences now. Investigations were ongoing. Discussions about new policies had started, and the public wasn't letting this story fade away. But Naomi wasn't done. Change wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about making sure it never happened again. She was back at the station, standing outside Chief Anderson's office. She took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in." She pushed the door open. Anderson was at his desk, reading a file. He looked up, his face unreadable. "You've been busy," he said. Naomi closed the door behind her. "So have you." Anderson sighed, setting the file aside. "The department is under pressure. The mayor's office is involved now. Everyone is looking for someone to blame." Naomi crossed her arms. "And who are they blaming?" Anderson studied her. "That depends. Some want to blame the officers. Some want to blame training. And some," he paused, "some think you should have handled this differently." Naomi felt a flicker of frustration. Handled it how? By staying quiet. Anderson leaned forward. By giving the department a chance to deal with it internally. Naomi let out a dry laugh. Internally, like how we've handled it in the past. A quiet suspension, a closed-door conversation, and then back to normal. Anderson didn't answer right away. He looked tired, older than he had a week ago. Finally, he sighed. "You're right." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "What?" Anderson ran a hand through his hair. "You're right. We've done things the same way for too long. And maybe that's why nothing changes." For the first time in days, Naomi felt a flicker of hope. Anderson straightened. "I've been talking to the mayor's office. They want to create a task force. Something real. Not just for show. A team to review training, policies, and officer accountability." He met her eyes. "I want you to lead it." Naomi's breath caught for a second. "Me? You started this," Anderson said. "Now finish it." For a moment, Naomi said nothing. She thought about all the people who had been in her position, the ones who didn't have a voice, the ones who never got justice. This was her chance to make sure they did. She took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm in." The city was still waking up, the golden light of dawn stretching over the skyline. Naomi Carter stood near the large windows of the mayor's office, watching as the world outside carried on. People rushed to work, cars moved in an endless stream, and life continued as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Behind her, voices filled the room. City officials, department heads, and members of the newly formed task force were deep in conversation. They were here to discuss policies, to find ways to rebuild trust, to fix what was broken. Naomi had spent years working for this moment, yet she knew this was only the beginning. "Captain Carter," Mayor Richardson's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see the mayor watching her, an expectant look on her face. "You've been quiet." Naomi folded her arms. "Just listening." The mayor nodded. "What do you think?" Naomi glanced around the room, then took a deep breath. "I think we're talking about rules and policies, but we're forgetting the most important part. People." A few officials exchanged glances. Naomi continued, "We can change policies all we want, but if officers don't change how they see the people they serve, nothing will be different." Chief Anderson, who had been silent so far, finally spoke. "So how do we fix that?" Naomi met his gaze. "We start with accountability. Real accountability. Not just suspensions, not just training videos. We need real consequences for officers who abuse their power. And we need to make sure those who do the right thing don't feel like they're alone." The room was silent for a moment. Then Rachel, who was now part of the task force, spoke up. "She's right. The good officers, because there are good ones, need to know that standing up for what's right won't cost them their careers." The mayor nodded slowly. "All right, let's build a plan. Real reform. Real oversight." Naomi felt something shift in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she believed change was possible. Not because of policies, not because of meetings, but because people were finally ready to listen. And this time, she wouldn't let them forget.